Welcome to Cross-Border Tax Talks, where we discuss the latest trends in international taxation, from geopolitics to the OECD's latest developments. I'm Doug McHoney, PwC's International Tax Services Global Leader. The Pillar 2 engine from PwC is a game changer for Pillar 2 modeling, provision, and compliance calculations. Built on a graph system utilizing over 20 years of international tax technology, this centralized rules engine is built by a team of Pillar 2 tax experts from around the globe. PwC's Pillar 2 engine is currently available as a service and will be licensable in July 2024. On this week's episode of Cross-Border Tax Talks, we're back in PwC's Policy on Demand studio in Washington, D.C., where I'm excited to have Craig Stronberg back on the podcast. Craig is a senior director in PwC's intelligence team, spearheading a team of analysts specializing in providing macroeconomic and geopolitical intelligence. Prior to joining PwC, Craig worked in the Office of the Director of National Intelligence. Craig, it's great to have you back on.
Thank you for having me back on.
Although this time we don't have an audience of 300 people, it's just you and me in the studio, so we'll see how we do.
Yeah.
So Craig, you spent almost 2 decades in the intelligence community before joining PwC, admittedly a much different background than myself. Before we dive into the major geopolitical trends impacting business leaders, do you have like a spy story or something that you could share with our tax audience?
So I think all of the spy stories, such as they are, right, that I know are probably classified for a while, but the one that I like that nobody ever pays any attention to is a World War II double agent named Garbo, who was a Spaniard. And over the course of several years, he convinced German intelligence in Spain that he had a network of about 75 different assets in England that he was gaining information from. The man developed separate writing styles for every one of them, separate little accents on some of the video calls. He had their family trees invented, and he completely fooled them. He even had a part in helping to fool the Germans about when the D-Day landings would occur. And so there's all these little, just sort of normal people in history that played these outsized parts in intelligence operations that are sort of out there for people to discover.
Yeah, there's a lot of great museums here in DC, and one of my favorites, and my wife's favorite, as well as the Spy Museum here. And
it's like pretty good.
Packed with all these little different stories. I mean, there's a number of really outstanding institutions and various museums and things, but the Spy Museum is a particularly good one.
Spy Museum, good, for sure.
All right, so let's move on to geopolitics and macroeconomics, because I mean, Craig, I felt like there was a lot going on when we had you on about a year ago, and the world hasn't gotten any calmer, at least it doesn't seem, but we're going to test that theory. What should business leaders just generally expect in 2024?
So look, I think that we have to remember, and I think we talked about this, the last podcast, in California, is if you take the titles away, right, people that lead companies are just people. Right, and they, like us, I mean, they were so desperate to get past, all the complications that COVID had to offer, in terms of family life, personal life, business life, global life. And we have largely gotten past that, but I don't think we fully understand the lasting ripple effects. And when I say ripple, it's not like ripples on a pond. It's more like aftershocks of an earthquake.
Okay.
That really still are coming out of that COVID period in terms of geopolitics, and how much shaking up of the world COVID continues to do because of the weaknesses that it exposed, the assumptions that it exposed. And what it really did is and this is what I'm hearing the most from business leaders, is it put them in a position where getting back to normal is getting farther and farther away. And by normal, I mean a geopolitical environment that is far more predictable than it is today, which is what most business leaders, wherever you are, right? China, Italy, United States, for most of your careers, you've lived and worked in that environment where you could make some assumptions generally about next quarter or the quarter after that, and you'd probably be right. Now, every quarter brings new geopolitical crises, new geopolitical uncertainties, That's much harder for business leaders to focus on and much harder for them to operate in. And so it is this institutionalizing of geopolitical uncertainty and disruption that is causing a lot of business leaders all over the world real problems.
Yeah, one of the things that you have written and I've heard you speak about is something called VUCA. Volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity. Can you unpack those for us as kind of key themes for 2024?
I can. So people who have heard of VUCA before probably know it from one of two sources. Most of them probably know it the way that I knew it, which was from the Pentagon, right? Who used this term a lot to describe the state of the world in US-USSR relations. But it actually goes back to economic theory in the 50s is where it was created. We've talked in the past about disequilibrium, right? The unsettling that we just mentioned of the geopolitical and to a degree the macroeconomic environments post-COVID. This has been coming for a while. Like if you look at this from a historical point of view, it starts even before the global financial crisis, but that's probably the first big rock in the avalanche to fall, in which there's not just economic damage that's done, there's damage that's done to the US's image and brand as, in many people's opinion, fair or not, the guarantor of the global economy. The 2010s see a huge amount of disruption, right? There's a lot of people that are gaining new ground and new forms of communication. Brexit occurs. There's a loss of unity in a lot of places where we thought there was a lot of unity. All of that leads up to COVID and the disruption. And so VUCA is really about the words that define it, right? The operating environment is volatile, it is uncertain, it is complex, and probably worst of all, it is ambiguous. And what all of those conditions, right, combined and on their own mean, the people that are trying to run multinational corporations and businesses, is that you have to find a way to deal with all of that. And that is incredibly complicated when all the ground rules keep changing because crises occur in places that you don't have a lot of familiarity. And you've continued, because you have to, make assumptions about supply chain, and trade, and globalization, and pricing, and talent, and labor, and investment. But the VUCA that is unleashed is challenging all of those in ways that are very difficult for businesses without a lot of spare time to anticipate.
Yeah, and I'll acknowledge that I was not aware of this particular acronym, although I've got quite a few acronyms up my sleeve from a tax perspective. But we talk about volatility, uncertainty, complexity, ambiguity. For the tax audience here on the Cross-Border Tax Talks, I think we could use that acronym and those four words to describe the current tax environment, certainly. And not only with respect to Pillar 2, which we spent a lot of airtime here talking about, but just as various countries continue to change and adopt their rules, it creates, I think, a lot of volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity for taxpayers. And it's certainly something that is echoed in the geopolitical ecosystem, so to speak. So what I wanted to do was go through some of the key geopolitical trends for 2024 that you have identified and maybe fit some of the latest current events and kind of what's happening around the world within each of these particular trends. The first one that you identified is protectionism. And so maybe kind of setting the table, what do we mean by protectionism? I think most of us have a working definition, but what do you mean by protectionism? And why is that a trend for 2024?
So it's a key one. I'm glad we're actually talking about it first because I'm not sure that it's one that always gets its due in terms of what should be understood. I think it's often compartmentalized in terms of somebody on the staff is going to take care of that problem. The challenge is that protectionism has been, particularly in the United States, right, on the march in terms of its regulatory impact, its sophistication, its power, for several years. What really changed this was Ukraine. Ukraine, here in DC, allowed the policymakers to bring out a playbook they're very comfortable with, and that's the Cold War playbook. Right? We're not in a Cold War with Russia, but there are elements of that diplomacy, that military policy that they are using to exercise their Ukraine policy. that got them thinking, well, we also have to deal with the rise of a strategic competitor, right, across the Pacific that we don't have a good grasp on how to deal with. We probably need to protect US technology, US know-how, US data better. And they have begun to do that aggressively. One of the things that we have seen the most of, actually, since we talked last, is there's regulatory enforcement that happens in the daylight, and there's quiet conversations that are not. And one of the most concerning things that a lot of businesses across sectors are having is a series of protectionist quiet conversations. And what these are is that businesses of all sizes get a visit from senior officials in the US government. It's not an inspection, it's not a regulatory mandate, it's conversation, often with the C-suite of the board. And sometimes soft suggestions are made about places that they should or should not be emphasizing in terms of investment. And then they leave. And the board and the C-suite is there to figure out, what do we do now? And if you watch, since we talked last in spring, the front page of business journals, you'll see the impacts of this. People have stopped doing business because the US government in some cases wants them to get online with protectionist policy. And the last thing I'll say about protectionist policy is US policy is attempting to be exported globally. And what that means is that we are trying to get partner governments and companies globally, not US companies, to agree to sell and not sell certain types of technology to certain markets the way that we would like them to or not like them to, which is bold. And some of them are saying yes, most of them are saying yes, but I'm not sure that's going to last forever. And so this complicates any global operating environment, and there's probably going to be a lot more of it to come.
Is protectionism, in your view, just a trend in the US? What about, for example, like in Germany, I mean, just the global political, and we'll talk a little bit more about the global political environment, but is protectionism really just a theme in the US, or where else what other countries do you see it as a potential theme?
That's a great question, because it needs to be clarified. It is happening globally. So you see this in different flavors. So a lot of this comes down to one of three buckets. It comes down to countries, whether you're Germany, the United States, Italy, China, France, whatever it may be, wanting to protect critical technology, which that country defines, and those definitions are not always the same. Critical infrastructure, which governments define and are not always the same, and data. And data is the one where we're seeing a lot of protectionism. So in China, for instance, and increasingly in other places in Asia, they have regulatory regimes to make sure that if you ideate or you generate ideas off of those citizens in those markets, that return on investment should be there. So if you ideate in that country and that idea sells new products somewhere else, some of that money should come back because the data was generated there. That's sometimes a hard thing to enforce, but that's happening a lot. And you see in Europe, they're trying to do this from the opposite angle, where they're trying to protect individual, citizens' rights. But most of the global 20, right, most of the G20 has a protectionist regime that is bulking up. What none of them are quite doing yet is what we are doing in terms of asking foreign companies to enforce our policy. That's a new wrinkle, and it's making some global companies very uncomfortable.
Okay, so let's move on to our second trend then for 2024, the US-China rivalry. Talk a little bit about that.
So, again, it's interesting. I mean, not that I don't like to see you, Doug, but it's good that it's probably been a little while because stuff has changed. Like, one of the things that we talked about, in the spring last year was that there is this long time relationship between Joe Biden and Xi Jinping, right? Which means that, I don't know if they like one another, but I think that at the end of the day, they probably trust one another. And they probably talk more than is generally understood. Both of them worked really hard, and their administrations worked really hard in the latter half of last year and the early part of this year to get U.S.-China relations on a really solid footing. Like, it may not look like much has changed, but you have more U.S. officials going back and forth across the Pacific for substantive meetings in the last 6-7 months than you've had in many, many years prior. So U.S.-China relations are actually pretty good. I think China's doing a pretty good job of walking the line between doing things that might push that towards a more tense relationship. I think the challenge for the U.S. is going to be we're entering a campaign season where China is at some point going to be a talking point, right? How do both sides individually and collectively look at China theoretically in the coming 4 years? And that rhetoric could rub people the wrong way. But for right now, U.S.-China relations are actually pretty good. I think the biggest question for businesses is they are losing some confidence in the Chinese market. They're not leaving en masse. And at the end of the day, I don't know that a lot of them are going to leave at all. But they're having some crisis of confidence because of the regulatory, because of the protectionist regime there. And that's causing some problems.
Yeah, and there's certainly a lot of rhetoric here in the U.S. from a tax perspective related to China. What I mean by that is that there certainly have been a number of proposals and from the House Ways and Means Committee, for example, about tax policies designed to limit, China's potential impact on the U.S. economy. So certainly something that we've seen from a tax perspective with respect to that rivalry. So I do think it's interesting because that's not necessarily my perspective from a tax viewpoint,
right.
that things have improved or that there's been more communication.
Well, I guess the question that I would have, though, is from a non-tax protectionist point of view, you're probably going to see more new regulatory power granted by the new Congress in 2025, not this one, because neither one wants to really give the other side any new ammunition. I'm not sure if that's true of global tax policy. I'm not sure if there'd be more action in 2025 than this year or not.
Well, I think from a tax perspective, what I would expect is that, first of all, we mentioned and talked about the Pillar 2 as this new global minimum tax, which really is transformative as the first, really truly global tax system of its type. From a U.S. perspective, there are a number of provisions that came in during the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act from the Trump administration that expire in 2025. So whoever the new president is, whoever the new Congress is, certainly is going to have to address corporate international taxation, amongst a whole other bunch of areas in tax. But that is kind of what I have been referring to as a reflection point from a U.S. tax perspective. And I think listeners should expect some really significant changes, whether those are just changes that occur naturally, so to speak, as a result of things that are already built into the statute. But if prior experience and precedence is indicative of future results, the new administration, again, whoever that will be, will likely need to come in and make significant changes, particularly from a corporate international tax perspective. And what I view as will be very interesting to see, does the U.S. kind of head more towards Pillar 2 and this global system, or do they continue to kind of keep the existing framework, which is really not consistent with the global minimum tax framework?
Yeah.
All right, so let's move on to our third topic, distrust. Who's distrusting whom?
Everybody's distrusting everybody.
That would have been my guess.
Yeah, and
my viewpoint.
Look, there's a direct line from this back to where we started this conversation about VUCA, disequilibrium, COVID-19's lingering policies. Trust is what makes geopolitics work. Do you trust when you sit across the table from another country's representatives, right? Be they bankers, diplomats, military officers. Do you trust when they say, yes, we're going to do that they're going to do that or not? There's always been distrust, but there's so much distrust in the system now that sometimes those conversations aren't even being given the chance to happen because people are going to assume, I'm not going to believe what those guys tell me. And that's not just true of adversaries. That's true of people who are not just partners, but allies. Who have a trust deficit to make up, because of some of the things that happened during COVID that weren't always in the public eye, but the governments know what happened. And this is a real challenge. And a lot of this comes to from a global point of view, right? Not necessarily from a US point of view. The world is not sure what to make of the United States these days. It thought they had a pretty good grasp on the world. You know, most of the time, if you go back to World War II and onward, regardless of who was in office, Republican or Democrat, they might turn the ship, 5 degrees this way and 5 degrees that way. But if you were sitting as a president in Cairo or Tanzania or Australia, by and large, you dealt with that person the same way. Mm-hmm. And you could expect sort of the same brand. In the last, 10 years or so, that certainty hasn't evaporated, but it's been challenged. And the US population is a complex thing to understand from the outside. It's complex to understand in the US.
For sure.
So I think a lot of trading partners, diplomatic partners, are having a very difficult time understanding the United States. And that doesn't always lead to distrust, but it's right on the road to distrust. And so I think that problem of distance, frustration, volatility, disequilibrium in the US system has global implications too, including for trade and globalization.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and certainly for tax policy as well. All right, the next geopolitical trend, supply side world. And this is obviously something that has significant tax implications and has impacted many of our listeners, because as supply chains have changed, there's obviously cross-border tax implications, and figuring out what that after-tax cost of those supply changes, the supply side change, or those supply changes certainly are something that our listeners are very familiar with. But talk a little bit about the geopolitical trend of a supply side world, as you labeled it.
So this is, again, something that is not completely, but partially an outgrowth of COVID, where it's just not okay for some things that you need to keep your country healthy to be only produced in one place. Because when everybody needs that thing, you may be 28th or 128th in line to get it. And that's no longer okay. And so you've seen this change in the emphasis on necessarily manufacturing and operations that are only done because of labor arbitrage or cost, in terms of getting things a little closer to home. And that has produced enormous opportunities for countries in Eastern Europe, for Mexico, to India to a degree, to ASEAN. This comes to at this time where, like we mentioned a few minutes ago, there's some broad multinational concern about what lies ahead in terms of market stability in China. Not growth, but how easy it is to do business there in the coming years. So all of that is causing some real potential shifts, and we are seeing some shifts in terms of nearshoring and friendshoring. Mm-hmm. It also helped because the US government opened up the checkbook, right? It passed a couple of very large acts that helped us.
Including the CHIPS Act.
Including the CHIPS Act and the IRA. But
yep.
I think the questions are going to come down to a bunch of macroeconomic factors. So one of them is going to be, is it actually true that if you build it, they will come? And what we mean by that is you can build a chip plant, but can you find the engineers sufficient to work it? And some of the Asian manufacturers that are opening up or planning to open up plants in the United States have everything they need here, but they can't find the talent they want, which surprised them because that's not what they thought would happen. And you're seeing replicas of that talent problem in other places. And that's happening in the United States for a bunch of reasons, but there's a talent challenge, there's sometimes a capital challenge, there are logistical challenges, there are infrastructure challenges, there's challenges in terms of access to things like water, and there's all the localization of just trying to understand the complexity of some of the markets that these are going into. So I think these trends are going to continue. I think they're all positive, but at some point, if you really want them to continue, you probably need a CHIPS Act 2 and a CHIPS Act 3 and a CHIPS Act 4 and an infrastructure investment part 2. And that's asking a lot of a very, divided system.
Sure. Yeah, any legislation, particularly in the US. One of the things that I found interesting, again, from my tax lens, particularly with respect to supply chain, is after COVID and some of the protectionist policies that we've discussed, the concept of nearshoring, friendshoring. I love the friendshoring term. But I'm not sure that many listeners or people not involved understand how long it takes for like these major multinational organizations, I don't care whether it's US parented or whatever group, how long it takes. I mean, it can be years for companies to be able to establish the infrastructure, and whether it's manufacturing, I don't care what it is. But that these supply chain changes, even though companies make it a priority, take a very long time to play out.
They take a very long time to play out, and unfortunately, we are late to this game. Like, two of the earliest players of this game were the South Koreans and the Japanese, right, who have been investing in alternative markets, in East Asia and Southeast Asia for decades, to the point that the way that we identify in the United States,
we being the US,
right? We identify basketball talent beginning, when they're 6. If you are a multinational Northeast Asian technology company, you understand who's winning science fairs in ASEAN, because you're following those kids and you want to get them signed up to be an engineer before they get to high school, because the talent is so scarce to make some of these really high-tech processes work, especially in smaller markets. So this is one of the things that we're dealing with in the U.S. is we should have more talent for this, but because we always outsource this stuff, we don't have enough of a base. And so some of these challenges in terms of training, education, they're going to continue.
Yeah, and it ties in directly to what you were talking about. Just if we're going to make, there's going to be more manufacturing in the U.S., we have to have the skill set of those people to actually do that work.
Yes.
All right, so that's a good transition then to our next geopolitical trend, which is tech disruption. And Gen AI, there's been a lot of airtime on that. I, in fact, had dedicated an entire podcast to that several episodes ago. What do you mean by tech disruption?
So that's a part of it, but I think where we're thinking about this more is from the geopolitical and macroeconomic lens. And a lot of this comes down to the fact that, one of the things that is not a secret is that if you want to do some of the most high-tech stuff in terms of manufacturing, construction, experimentation, design, some of that is limited by the raw material you can get. Most of that raw material is not shared freely, right? Most people have monopolies on it, especially in Asia. Geopolitics affects the flow of some of those goods. It affects their availability. And that, in turn, you talked about the years-long process of building factories. It's the same thing for design.
Sure.
And you have to make a certain amount of assumptions about your availability of raw materials very early in that process. And while U.S.-China relations are good at the moment, at any time they could become negative, though the availability of some of those technologies, those raw materials, could be a little harder for us to get. I think this also gets back to the protectionist angle, because data protection, the protection of data itself, is wrapped up here in tech nationalism. And so all of that is part of this, and it's getting to the point where it's very hard to separate geopolitics from global technology flows.
So another topic that you have spoken, written about is the shifting global power, and particularly the rise of the global South. And so I'm interested in hearing your perspective on that. And then also, we've got 50 elections, I think, around the world that are taking place that will also presumably shift global power depending how those elections turn out. But why is that a geopolitical trend for 2024? Maybe unpack that.
So nobody knows how history is ever going to look at a certain period. I have a hunch, though, that 10, 15 years from now, when we look back at the last couple of years, one of the most consequential but least examined geopolitical moments is going to be when there was the invasion of Ukraine and the United States put out the call for countries around the world to economically isolate Russia, very few people said yes. Most people either abstained, they didn't answer, or they said no. And amongst those who said no were US partners and allies. Right? I think many US citizens would be excused in believing that that's actually not true, that it's the reverse. But most of the world said no, and that didn't just have to do with the US or Ukraine or Russia. A lot of that had to do with real, honest resentment that has been building in Africa, in Asia, in Latin America, and other places in the world for decades, because they've had their own invasions. They've had their own wars, their own crises, and for whatever reason, including some very justifiable reasons, there wasn't a lot of help that came, from anybody in the G20 or from the US or Europe. And sometimes it was the opposite. And they therefore said, we aren't going to get on board with another one of these because you weren't there for us. And they have begun talking to one another about this. And this really connects to the demographics. Like, it's not going to be too long before 1 out of every 4 people who walks the earth is going to be African, which is amazing in some ways and presents all kinds of interesting possibilities for a population that has been underrepresented in terms of power globally. They're going to want their fair share, and they should, right? They see the world, there are many countries in the global south that see the world very differently than we do in the United States or Europe does. And they're increasingly very frustrated with the rules. And you saw this probably 2 or 3 months ago. There was that mini revolt at the EU about Pillar 2, at the UN, which right. Didn't really go anywhere. The fact that happened, though, I think was an indicator of things to come. It's an indicator that whether or not they succeed all the time, those who consider themselves to have been disenfranchised or given less of the pie than they probably should have had, they're going to be more and more vocal in the coming years. And I'm not sure that most of the world is ready for that. And I think what the business world needs to understand about that is that this could present all kinds of interesting opportunities. But it's going to require you to understand parts of the world where you probably don't pay a lot of attention right now.
Yeah, and you're referencing the developing countries at the UN who were really pushing back on Pillar 2 and saying that it was more the developed countries that were going to be the winners, and that they were potentially exposed. And there's been a whole bunch of additional conversations about what should the UN's role be in global taxation policy versus the OECD's role, and we'll also see how that continues to play out. Any comments on, as we think about shifting global power and kind of related with the 50 elections and what business leaders need to think about given all the volatility with respect to and uncertainty with respect to these major elections around the globe?
So, sorry, I forgot that one. So it is kind of unusual that you have this many, especially in very consequential countries, like India, for instance. So the first one out of the bat, what we already had was, Taiwan. And, that went pretty much as expected. I think the election that obviously most business leaders in the US and globally are focused on is the one in the US.
Sure.
Because it connects so much to everything we've talked about so far, and probably everything we're going to talk about for the rest of the podcast. But that's the one where I think there is the most uncertainty. So there's probably going to be more eyes on the US election, but every one of these elections is impacted by polarization locally. It is impacted by distrust. It is impacted by people who increasingly feel disenfranchised and now have more voice or more ability technologically to give voice to that disenfranchisement. But you're probably still going to see most of the incumbents win, especially in places like India.
And you mentioned polarization, and that is one of the other trends. And I think one of the things that's been particularly interesting since I've been in my global role and have been traveling all over the world, that that polarization that we see in the U.S. is not unique to
No.
the U.S. And it's fascinating to me as I've traveled around throughout Asia and Europe that is certainly a theme that I have seen and experienced around the globe. So maybe the last trend that I want to mention, and then I have a couple of other questions, is one of the geopolitical trends that you mentioned is labor. So talk a little bit about that, because that's really important for business leaders as they look into their crystal balls and think about planning for their future.
So you're seeing huge shifts in labor, globally, but especially here in the US. And this is linked very closely to the educational experience that happens to people during COVID, but it also has to do with how many people, younger people especially, look at the value of higher education, look at the value of certain skills, tend to value different macroeconomic and life rewards differently. But it also has to do with things like immigration. Like we're missing, regardless of policy, just macroeconomically, you're missing something like 1.4 million immigrants from the economy that should be there generating, GDP, generating taxes. And polarization is holding a lot of that up. And so getting labor into the country is becoming more polarized, much more difficult to do even white collar labor policy. And a lot of this comes down to people wanting to earn different levels of living because rates aren't what they used to be, wages aren't what they used to be, and you're seeing a lot of disparity. But if you look back at the last 3 years, labor has been a wild story. I mean, if you go back a couple of years, we were starting to see franchises, fast food franchises, offer enormous bonuses for people because there was such a dearth of talent. And then you moved on to the next labor story, and the next labor story, and the next labor story. So the labor market itself is very difficult to understand because of all the demographic, macroeconomic, geopolitical forces that are operating on it that make making assumptions about it very challenging.
And I mean, that's just played out in the press, right? Like it's been amazing just how strong the labor market has continued to be in the U.S., defying pretty much most economists' predictions. It's just like, it feels like every time we get a report from the feds, it's just like, well, we're exceeding where we are from an overall labor perspective.
Yes.
All right, so let me talk about at least one thing that you haven't mentioned as we talk about all of these trends for 2024. You haven't mentioned the Middle East. Any comments on that, Craig? Is this something that business leaders need to be focused on? Is this potential major disruption that could really impact global business? And we've seen obviously some of the supply chain or some of the issues with respect to ships and the global shipping. But what is this issue? What are these issues in the Middle East? And there are a number of them mean for global businesses.
So I think sort of analogous to the start of the war in Ukraine, you had some global companies that were immediately affected, either because they had personnel or assets or capital or technology that they needed to relocate. And they pretty much did quickly. Any company that I think is largely affected by some of what's happening on the ground has probably done most of that already. The one that I think will have the most lasting impact is the one that you mentioned, which is the shipping. I think the good news there is that the powers that be responded pretty quickly to that one, and I think they will continue. I mean, transit through the Red Sea is particularly important, for global trade.
Sure.
Depending on the stats you look at, it's somewhere between 20 and 30% of global container traffic goes through the Red Sea. So I think that U.S. Navy, the British Navy, others are going to keep that open. But I think part of what's important to understand, and this connects back to the Global South argument, is a lot of these conflicts have been going on for years. They didn't get a lot of attention until all of a sudden they could be theoretically connected to other things or directly to business. Because in many ways, these are sort of normal course of business, of cost of business, of doing operations in certain places in the world, where these are groups that have been doing what they're doing for a long time. And I think most businesses that had to react to them have probably done that already.
So, I mean, is your view, and this, there's been plenty written on, has World War III already started? As we think about what's taking place in the war in Israel, as we think about some of the issues that with Iran and the Houthi, for example, do I have that right?
Houthi,
The
yeah.
Houthis, yeah, not the Houthi, that's entirely different. So, the Houthis. Should this be a major concern for multinationals that we are at the beginning of World War III, or is your point really that we've been dealing with global business, multinationals have been dealing with unrest in the Middle East for decades, and just something to continue to keep an eye on?
So it's a great question. So depending on who you ask in the world, some people will tell you that World War III has already been fought. Like, there are a significant number of people that would tell you, especially in Africa, that the Great African War, which was fought for the late 90s, early 2000s, which killed 5-6 million people, dragged in countries from all over the world, displaced millions of people. That might qualify as World War III from their eyes. Didn't get a lot of attention other places. I would think that the Houthis know that their struggle doesn't get a lot of attention. It's a reasonable posit, right, to ask, because there's so much going on. Mm-hmm. There's so many missiles in the air that it's not normal, right, based on what we have understood in terms of recent decades. I don't think this is getting down that road. What I do think it means, though, is two things for business. One of them is you probably need to have a better understanding of the next ones that could happen, because there are some. And you probably also need to understand the true nature of the people and the parties involved. And I'll give you two quick examples. Like, Iran, for a variety of reasons, I think is very misunderstood in the United States. The powers that be in Tehran are pretty rational actors. Like, I don't think that they want any kind of conflict with the United States. But I also don't think they can always control, right, people who speak in their name, that claim to be allied with them. That's a very difficult thing to do anywhere in the world, especially in that part of the world. But I don't think you're going to see national leaders make foolish decisions that could get us to that kind of brink. But the other thing that businesses need to understand, because this has direct implications for things like cybersecurity, is there are countries out there that are trying to foment and stir things up to distract the United States so that they can sort of see how many things can the United States deal with geopolitically at once before their system switches from other things. And the US is well aware of that. Those countries are well aware of that. There's a lot of that goes on. And I think we're seeing some of that happen in certain places in the world.
All right, last question for you here. Is there one particular threat, or maybe a number of threats, that, in your view, should keep business leaders up at night? You've already mentioned a number of things throughout the course of the podcast, but is there one thing or a couple of things that business leaders should particularly keep an eye on?
So I think there's two. One of them is, I would like to say that business really took stock. And when I say business, I mean individual companies, even sectors and industries, took the time after COVID to take stock of what went well and what didn't go well, so that if that happened again, they'd be better prepared in terms of operations, sales, personnel, profit, you name it.
We've certainly done that.
We have.
My business, yep.
I know some businesses who have, because I don't think that's the last time we're going to go through that. I don't know that it's necessarily going to be as bad, but the other historical anomaly that happened during COVID, which changed everything, is we actually got a vaccine, which is not a guarantee. And we could go through one of those where that could take years. And if that's the case, all the learning that business leaders went through, if they haven't actually learned from it, that could be a problem. And I'm worried that we aren't as prepared as we probably should be, as countries, as systems, as sectors, as businesses. I think the other one is the end game in Ukraine, which doesn't show any signs of sort of wrapping up one way or another anytime soon. And by anytime soon, I mean probably this year. But I think as we get into 2025 or the end of 2024, both sides are going to have to make some very difficult decisions. And I think some of the most dire scenarios that businesses all over the world would care about in terms of the potential, departure of tens of millions of Ukrainians westward, which could destabilize the economy and political systems in Europe and spread from there. Those things become much more likely as scenarios that business has to think about. In short, I think the business world has been able to largely ignore Ukraine for most of 2023, and they will probably continue to largely do it in 2024. I don't think that's going to last forever, and they probably start thinking about it this year.
All right, great advice. Craig, always fascinating. I love these conversations. I mean, I'm a tax nerd at heart, but the geopolitical stuff I love, and I really appreciate you coming on and enjoyed the conversation.
Thank you so much for having me back. I appreciate it.
All right. Well, thanks for tuning in to this week's episode of Cross-Border Tax Talks. Thank you, Craig Stronberg, Senior Director of PwC Intelligence. I'm Doug McHoney, PwC's International Tax Services Global Leader. Stay tuned for another exciting edition of the Cross-Border Tax Talks podcast.
This podcast is brought to you by PwC, all rights reserved. PwC refers to the U.S. member firm or one of its subsidiaries or affiliates and may sometimes refer to the PwC network. Each member firm is a separate legal entity. Please see www.pwc.com/structure for further details. This podcast is for general information purposes only and should not be used as a substitute for consultation with professional advisors.